All right, so you're prepping for that big climate warriors meeting and need to get up to speed on the Paris Agreement quickly.
We've got you.
We're diving straight into the need to know insights on this one.
What's remarkable about the Paris Agreement is what it represents, really. It was a turning point. Before 2015, international climate action was a little bit fragmented. It was like a puzzle with missing pieces. The Paris Agreement brought those pieces together. It united nearly 200 countries with this shared mission to combat climate change.
Yeah, it's hard to believe it's been that long since the agreement, was initially signed. So much has happened since then. So remind me, what's the elevator pitch for the Paris Agreement? What's the big idea?
The goal is a world where we've managed to keep global warming in check. The Paris Agreement aims to limit global temperature increase this century to well below 2 degrees Celsius. And that's compared to pre-industrial levels, ideally even hitting a target of 1.5 degrees.
Okay, so that's the big ambitious goal. How do they actually plan on achieving that?
So it's built on this foundation of countries setting their own targets for reducing greenhouse gas emissions, what they call nationally determined contributions, or NDCs, but it goes beyond that. The agreement also addresses the urgent need for adaptation and the critical role of climate finance, particularly for developing countries.
Okay, so we've got nearly 200 countries each setting their own goals. It can't be as simple as just saying, hey, do your best to reduce emissions, right?
Right, it's definitely more nuanced than that. The agreement has this three-pronged approach. You've got tackling the root cause of climate change, which is mitigating emissions, then adapting to the impacts that are already happening, and then third, providing the financial resources to make it all possible, especially for developing countries.
Okay, let's break those down one by one, starting with mitigation. What's the strategy there?
Mitigation boils down to this. How do we cut down on the greenhouse gases that we are pumping into the atmosphere? And the Paris Agreement takes kind of a bottom-up approach. Each country steps up and determines their own path for reducing emissions. They outline these commitments in what are called nationally determined contributions, or NDCs.
NDCs, I've heard that term thrown around a lot. Sounds like countries get to choose their own climate adventure.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. It recognizes that different countries have different realities. Developed nations, having contributed significantly to historical emissions, are expected to take a leading role. So that means ambitious reduction targets. Developing countries, on the other hand, have a bit more flexibility. They're still prioritizing economic growth. They might need some financial support to implement greener technologies.
Makes sense. You can't expect a country that's still developing to make the same cuts as a country that's been industrialized for centuries. So that covers reducing emissions going forward. But what about dealing with the impacts of climate change that are already sheer? That's where adaptation comes in, right?
Exactly. Adaptation is all about adjusting to this new reality of a changing climate. We're talking about building resilience to sea level rise, extreme weather events, shifts in agricultural patterns. It's about learning to live with and adapt to the changes that are already happening, and those to come.
Right. It's like we've already turned on the faucet. Now we have to figure out how to swim. So, how does the Paris Agreement tackle this aspect?
It pushes for this global effort to strengthen resilience and reduce vulnerability, particularly for those most at risk. A big part of this is financial and technological support from developed countries to help developing countries adapt.
Which makes sense because often the countries that have contributed the least to the problem are the ones hit hardest by the consequences.
Absolutely. And it's not just about protecting physical infrastructure. It's about safeguarding people's livelihoods and entire ecosystems. The Paris Agreement recognizes this interconnectedness and emphasizes these solutions tailored to specific contexts. For example, a small island nation facing rising sea levels will have very different adaptation needs than a landlocked country grappling with droughts.
Okay, so we've got countries setting their own targets, trying to reduce emissions and adapt to a changing climate. But none of this happens without some serious funding, right? It's like any ambitious project. You need the resources to make it happen.
You're hitting on a crucial point. That's where the finance element of the Paris Agreement comes in a big way.
So, we've got these three pillars, right? Mitigation, adaptation, and finance. But how do we know countries are actually following through on their commitments? It's not like there's this global climate police force, is there?
No climate police, haha.
Yeah.
But the Paris Agreement does have a system for keeping things on track. It's about transparency and working together.
Okay, so how does that work in practice?
Well, countries regularly report on their emissions, the actions they're taking, the support they're providing or receiving. It's like this global climate check-in.
Ah, so everyone's keeping each other accountable. What happens if a country isn't meeting its targets? Are there penalties?
The agreement is actually designed to be more supportive than punitive. It's about identifying where a country might need help to get back on track, maybe with technology or financing.
Makes sense. More about collaboration than punishment.
Right. And to add another layer of accountability, there's what's called the global stock take. Every 5 years, all the countries kind of take stock of how things are going. Are we on track to meet the goals of the Paris Agreement? What's working, what's not, what needs to change? The first one actually already happened back in 2023.
Interesting. It's like a progress report for the whole planet.
Yeah, exactly. And this global stock take can be a really powerful tool for driving further action. It lets countries learn from each other, share those success stories, and then ramp up their ambition based on the latest science and data.
This has been incredibly helpful. I feel like I have a much clearer understanding of what the Paris Agreement is all about. But just to bring it back to my situation, I'm heading into this meeting on climate change. And armed with this knowledge now, what are some smart questions I could ask?
Well, it's great that you're thinking about how this connects to your own work. You could ask about your company's specific targets related to the Paris Agreement. Are they aligned with the goals of the agreement,
Right.
both in terms of reducing emissions and adapting to a changing climate?
Yeah, that's a good one. It's one thing for countries to have these commitments, but companies play a huge role too.
Absolutely. And you could even broaden that out. Ask about your industry as a whole. How does it contribute to the goals of the agreement? What are the challenges and opportunities it faces?
Okay, I'm taking notes. So thinking about industry-wide trends, not just what our one company is doing.
Exactly. And here's a final thought to consider as you head into that meeting. The Paris Agreement hinges on global cooperation. So what do you think are the biggest obstacles to achieving that level of cooperation? And how can we overcome them?
That's a big question to end on. But such an important one. This isn't just about targets and deadlines. It's about people working together across borders and industries to create a more sustainable future for everyone.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Well, I feel much more prepared to dive into that meeting now. Thanks for walking us through this deep dive. And for our listeners, we hope you feel equipped to understand the significance of the Paris Agreement and maybe even spark some important conversations of your own. Until next time, keep those thinking caps on.